In the summer of 1973, a guitar hung on the wall of a music store in Austin, Texas, and nobody wanted it. It was a Fender Stratocaster, sunburst, and it looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. The finish was rubbed down to bare wood where somebody's forearm had rested against it for years. The frets were worn flat. The hardware was dull. It was not rare. It was not clean. It was not the kind of instrument a collector stops and looks at twice. The tag on it said $350. And it had been sitting on that wall long enough that the man who owned the shop had stopped expecting anyone to take it down. Then a skinny 19-year-old with no money, no record deal, and no reason for anyone to notice him walked through the door, lifted it off the hook, and plugged it in. 17 years later, that same beat-up guitar would be one of the most famous electric instruments on the planet. Guitar companies would build exact replicas of its scratches. Museums would put it behind glass. Grown men would stand in line just to look at a piece of wood. But here is the part almost nobody understands. The sound that came out of that guitar was never really in the wood. To understand why that instrument mattered, you have to go back 19 years to a small house in a neighborhood called Oak Cliff on the south side of Dallas. Stevie Ray Vaughan was born there in October of 1954. His father worked construction. The family moved when the work moved. Money was thin, and the house was small, and the loudest thing in it was the record player. He had an older brother named Jimmy, 3 years older, and Jimmy could already play. That is the first thing you need to understand about Stevie, because it explains everything that came after. He did not discover the guitar in a lightning bolt of destiny. He discovered it because it belonged to his big brother, and because his big brother was already better than everybody. Jimmy brought home records, blues records, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Albert King, Lonnie Mack, Freddie King, B.B. King, music made by men who had lived twice as long as the boys listening to it. And when Jimmy left the house, Stevie would go into his brother's room, take the guitar off the bed, and try to find the notes he had heard on those records. He was not reading music. There was no teacher. There was a needle on a record and a pair of ears, and a boy sitting cross-legged on a floor, lifting the needle, putting it back down, lifting it, putting it back down, playing the same 4 seconds 100 times until his fingers found it. That is how he learned. Not from a book, from obsession. But something else was happening in that room, and it stayed with him for the rest of his life. Every time he got close to the sound, he was still standing in the shadow of somebody who had gotten there first. He was the little brother. He was the one catching up, and a boy who spends his childhood catching up does not grow into a man who knows how to stop. By the time he was in high school, school itself had become an obstacle. He was in bands. He was playing clubs where he was too young to legally be standing. He was falling asleep in class because he had been on a stage until 2 in the morning. Eventually he stopped pretending, dropped out, and at 17 he did the only logical thing a Texas kid who wants to play blues can do. He moved to Austin. Austin in the early 1970s was not the polished music city it later became. It was cheap. It was loose. It was a town where you could live on almost nothing if you did not mind sleeping on a friend's floor and eating whatever was free at the bar. And it had stages, small ones, all over town, every night of the week. Stevie played all of them. He played for the door. He played for beer. He played for 6 people and a bartender who was not listening. He joined bands, left bands, got fired from bands. There are years in this part of the story where his entire net worth was an amplifier and whatever he was wearing. There was a club in Austin where the touring blues legends came through, the real ones, the men whose records he had worn out as a boy. And the local kids were allowed to back them up. So a broke young guitar player from Dallas got to stand 3 feet away from the people who invented the language he was trying to speak, and play it with them, in front of a paying crowd, with nowhere to hide. That is an education you cannot buy. It is also a test you cannot fake. Those men had spent their lives being copied by young players who had learned the notes and missed the point entirely, and they could hear the difference inside of one bar. He passed. That is the remarkable thing. Long before the world had any idea who he was, the originators had already decided he was the real article. And through all of it, he was chasing something he could not quite reach. He could play. Everybody in Austin knew he could play. But he still sounded like the records. He sounded like Albert King's phrasing and Jimi Hendrix's attack and Lonnie Mac's fire, all stacked on top of each other. He had the vocabulary. What he did not have yet was the voice. And then he walked into that music store. The shop was run by a man named Ray Hennig, a fixture of the Austin music scene. The kind of shop owner who knew every player in town by name and knew exactly which ones would never pay him back. Stevie was in there constantly. Everybody was. The guitar that changed everything came into that shop as a trade, the way most guitars did. Used. Unremarkable. A working man's instrument that had already been worked hard by somebody else. It went up on the wall with a price tag on it, and nothing about it said history. Stevie took it down, plugged it into an amplifier, and played a few bars. Nobody has ever fully explained what he heard. Guitars made in the same factory, in the same week, out of the same trees, do not sound the same, and every player who has spent enough time in a room full of them knows it. Something about the way that particular body resonated against his chest, the way the neck sat in his palm, the way a note hung in the air a half-second longer than it should have. It was not better on paper. It was correct for him. And by every account of what happened next, he did not put it back. He did not have $350. He never had $350. So he did what broke musicians have always done. He traded. He handed over a Stratocaster he already owned, walked out with the ugly one, and from that day until the last night of his life, that guitar almost never left his hands. He called it number 1. Now here is where the story gets strange, and where it stops being a story about a guitar and starts being a story about a man. Because number 1 was not a great instrument. It was, in the most literal sense, a mongrel. Years later, when experts finally pulled it apart and studied it properly, they found that its pieces did not come from the same guitar at all. The body was from one year. The neck was from a different year. The pickups appeared to be from somewhere else entirely. Somebody, at some point, had assembled it out of leftovers. In the collector world, that is a defect. A mismatched, refinished, parts bin guitar is worth a fraction of a clean original. If you had shown number 1 to a serious collector in 1973, he would have handed it back to you. So how does the least valuable guitar on the wall become the most important electric guitar of its generation? It does not on its own. It becomes that because of what the man did to it. The first thing Stevie did was change the vibrato arm. On a normal Stratocaster, the arm sits below your picking hand. Stevie fitted his with a left-handed unit, so the bar came up over the top instead. He had watched Jimi Hendrix play a right-handed guitar flipped upside down, and something about that image stayed in him. It was part tribute, part practicality, and part something harder to name, the sense that the instrument should be arranged around what he was reaching for, not what the factory had decided. The second thing he did was far more brutal. He put on the heaviest strings he could stand. Most electric players in the 1980s used light strings. Thin wire, low tension, easy to bend. It is how you play fast without destroying your hands. Stevie went the other direction. He strung number one with cables. Gauges so thick that most professional guitarists cannot fret them cleanly, let alone bend them a full step and a half the way he did, night after night. And because the tension was so extreme, he tuned the whole guitar down a half step, partly to save the neck, partly because he liked how it sat under his voice. Then he had the frets replaced with the tallest wire he could get, so there was more metal to grab and more room for his fingers to push. Every one of those choices made the guitar harder to play. Every single one. He did it because thick strings move more air. They hit the pickups harder. They give you a fatter, rounder, angrier note that does not thin out when you dig in. He wanted a tone with wig in it, and he was willing to pay for that tone with his own body. And he did pay. That is not a figure of speech. Stevie Ray Vaughan played with an attack that tore his hands apart. He did not stroke the strings. He hit them. Anyone who worked around him will tell you about the fingertips, the split skin, the calusas that ripped clean off in the middle of a show. He kept superglue in his gear. He would glue his own skin back down between songs and walk back out. There were nights he finished a set with blood on the pickguard. Think about that for a second. This is a man who chose a setup that made his instrument fight him, and then fought it in public, 5 nights a week, for years. And you have to ask why. Not why he wanted the tone, that part is easy. Why he needed it badly enough to bleed for it. Why every performance had the intensity of a last chance. Nobody makes their own life that difficult on purpose unless something inside them is being answered by the difficulty. The people closest to him said he was never satisfied. Not with a show, not with a take, not with a night the crowd had loved. He would come off a stage that had just been on its feet, screaming, and want to talk about the 2 bars he had gotten wrong. People hear his records and they say, "Listen to that tone." And they go looking for the tone in the equipment. What amplifier was that? What pickups? What cable? What year was the body? They are looking in the wrong place. The tone was in a man who refused to play anything easy. And underneath that, if you look closer, there is something sadder and more human. Because the man playing that hard was still, somewhere inside, the kid on the bedroom floor who was 3 years behind his brother and had to try twice as hard just to be in the room. That kind of drive is a gift. It is also a debt, and Stevie was going to be paying on it for a long time. Through the late 1970s he kept grinding. In 1970, the band that would carry him took shape, and eventually it settled into the lineup the world would come to know as Double Trouble, with Tommy Shannon on bass and Chris Layton on drums. Bass, drums, guitar. Nowhere to hide. If the guitar player was not carrying it, the song simply fell over. And still, no record deal. Because in 1981, the music industry had a very clear opinion about blues, and the opinion was that blues was finished. It was a museum piece. The charts belonged to synthesizers and drum machines and hair. Label executives listened to a young white kid from Texas playing loud, sweaty, 12-bar blues and heard a man who had shown up 20 years late. He was told no, repeatedly, by almost everyone. Then, in the summer of 1982, a producer named Jerry Wexler pulled a string he had no obvious reason to pull and got an unsigned bar band from Austin onto the bill at the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. That night should have ended his career. Stevie walked out in front of an audience that had come for jazz. Refined, seated, respectful jazz. He plugged in number one. turned it up to the volume he played at in Texas honky tonks, and hit them with everything he had. And part of the room booed him. Imagine it. The first time the wider world hears you, the first time you are on an international stage, after 9 years of sleeping on floors, and you can hear people jeering over your own amplifier. He walked off, shaken. By his own account, it stung for a long time afterward. But 2 people in that building were not booing. One of them was Jackson Browne, who found him afterward and offered him free time in his own recording studio in Los Angeles, no strings attached. The other was David Bowie, who was assembling a new record and had just heard a guitar sound he could not stop thinking about. Bowie asked him to play on an album called Let's Dance. It came out in 1983 and became one of the biggest records of the decade, and buried inside all that gleaming modern pop is a raw, cutting blues guitar that sounds like it wandered in from another planet. Meanwhile, Stevie had taken Jackson Browne up on that studio offer. He and Double Trouble went in over a holiday weekend and cut an entire album in a matter of days, playing live in the room. Almost no overdubs, almost no fixing. They called it Texas Flood. 2 records, 1 year. The unsigned guy who got booed in Switzerland became the most talked-about guitar player in America, and he did it holding a $350 parts guitar with the finish worn off. The industry that had told him blues was dead now had to explain why the biggest new guitar hero on the continent was playing nothing else. So this is the triumph. This is the part of the story where the credits are supposed to roll. Except the man who won was not the same man who had been fighting, and the thing that had driven him for all those years did not switch off just because he finally arrived. The next few years are a blur of touring, not weeks, years. Show after show, city after city, the same maximum effort performance every night, because he did not know how to give less. And the harder the schedule got, the more he leaned on the things that let him keep going. He had been drinking and using since he was young. Almost everyone around him had. In the world he came up in, it was scenery. Nobody flinched at it. But somewhere between the small clubs and the arenas, it stopped being something he did and became something that had him. Friends noticed. People who loved him noticed. He was thinner. He was exhausted in a way sleep did not fix. He was still playing brilliantly, which is part of what made it so easy for everyone to look away. Then, in the autumn of 1986, in the middle of a European tour, his body simply stopped cooperating. He collapsed. He was taken to a hospital in London, and there he was told, plainly, that if he continued the way he was going, he was not going to see very many more years. He was 32 years old. The tour was canceled. He went into treatment in Atlanta. And for the first time since he was a teenager, the guitar stayed in its case. That is the moment in this story that almost nobody makes a poster out of. There is no spotlight in it, no roaring crowd. Just a man in a room, out of excuses, being asked whether he actually wants to live. He did. He got clean, and by every account of the people closest to him, he stayed that way, and he worked at it like he had once worked at those records on his brother's floor. Deliberately. Daily. Without shortcuts. There was a fear in him at the start, and he admitted it more than once. He had never played a single note on a stage sober. Not one. He genuinely did not know whether the thing that made him who he was would still be there in the morning, or whether he had been trading his health for it all along without realizing. It was still there. It came back stronger and steadier, and it no longer sounded like a man outrunning something. And when he came back, something in the playing had changed. In 1989, he released an album called In Step. The title itself is an admission. Songs on that record deal directly with denial, with the wreckage he had caused, with the daily balancing act of staying upright. He was not hiding it. He was not romanticizing it either. He put it in the songs the way blues singers have always put their lives in songs, and the record won him a Grammy. People who saw him in 1980, 9 and 1990 talk about a man who looked lighter, still ferocious on stage, still hitting the strings like they had insulted him, but with something settled behind his eyes. He talked openly at shows about being sober. He talked to younger musicians about it. He was 35 years old, and he had, for the first time in his adult life, a future that he was actually looking forward to. And number one was falling apart. 17 years of those strings, that attack, that sweat. His guitar tech, René Martinez, kept it alive through refret after refret, and each time there was less wood left in the fingerboard to work with. The body was worn through in places. The letters he had stuck on the pickguard had lost pieces. There came a point where Martinez had to tell him the truth, that the neck had nothing left to give, and the guitar could not keep taking this. Stevie did not want to hear it. He owned better instruments. He owned prettier ones, newer ones that had not been assembled out of spare parts by a stranger. He kept coming back to this one. And then, in 1990, a piece of stage scenery came down and hit it, and the neck was broken. Number one went in for surgery. A neck from another of his Stratocasters was fitted to the old body. And the man who had refused to retire it kept playing it. A patched-together instrument on a patched-together life, both of them still standing. On the evening of August 26, 1990, he played an outdoor amphitheater called Alpine Valley in Wisconsin on a bill with Eric Clapton. At the end of the night, a group of them came out together for an encore. Clapton, Buddy Guy, Robert Cray, and Stevie's older brother Jimmy, the one whose records he had learned from, the one whose shadow he had spent his childhood inside. They had just finished making an album together, the two of them as brothers for the first time. It was, by all accounts, an extraordinary jam. People who were there described Stevie playing that night like a man with nothing left to prove and everything left to say. He came off stage, and the fog was thick, and he took a seat on a helicopter heading back toward Chicago. It went down in the dark, on a hillside, minutes after takeoff. There were no survivors. It was the early morning of August 27th, 1990. He was 35 years old, 4 years clean, and in the best shape of his adult life. The album he had made with his brother was released a month later. He never saw it come out. Number one was not on that helicopter. It was in its case, where it always was at the end of a night. It went to his family. Jimmy has it now. And after all those years of being played until it nearly disintegrated, it was finally allowed to rest. It comes out for exhibitions. It has been photographed, measured, catalogued, and studied down to the millimeter. Guitar companies have spent enormous amounts of money reproducing every crack in its finish and every worn spot on its neck, and they have sold those replicas to thousands of people. And every one of those people finds out the same thing eventually. You can buy the guitar. You can buy the strings, the amplifier, the pedals, the exact cable. There are people who have assembled the whole rig down to the last screw. And it does not sound like him. It never does. Because the wear on that instrument is not decoration. It is a record of what it cost. That bare patch on the body is 17 years of a man's forearm. That worn fingerboard is 1,000,000 bent notes. Those chips and burns and gouges are club stages and festival stages and hotel rooms and the years he was struggling and the years he was clean. The guitar did not make the sound. The guitar was where the sound was kept. A boy sat on a bedroom floor in Oak Cliff trying to catch up to his older brother. He never really stopped trying. That hunger drove him further than almost any guitarist of his generation, and it also nearly killed him. And he got sober and turned around and started to build something better. And then he ran out of time. $350 on a price tag. A guitar nobody else wanted, made out of pieces that did not match, hanging on a wall in Austin. It turns out that is a fairly good description of most of us. Assembled out of parts that do not quite fit. Marked up by things we did not choose. Worth almost nothing, on paper, to anyone taking inventory. What made number one legendary was not what it was made of. It was who picked it up, and how much he was willing to give it. That is the whole story. That is the entire secret. If this one moved you, leave a comment and tell me which Stevie Ray Vaughan song reached you first. And subscribe if you want more stories about the people behind the music we think we already know.